one has to realize that there was a Hebrew story written by an eyewitness. The old tradition that goes way back to Papias in 135 A.D. says that Matthew wrote it's quote, things or oracles of the Lord in Hebrew, and everyone translated or interpreted these as best he could. What obviously is happening in this ancient tradition is the recognition of the fact that the original story of Jesus was written in Hebrew. And what we've found in constant work on this for about 20 years is that the texts in Greek do return very beautifully, very often, to Hebrew. And there are fine little nuances, fine little details that indicate that we have remnants, if I may put it that way, which doesn't mean that they're not very complete. They are very complete, of that ancient text. What happened apparently was that the Hebrew text was translated literally to Greek. And that meant that you had a longer scroll than the original Hebrew. To translate to Greek from Hebrew, we know from earlier examples of the Septuagint, it took nearly twice as much scroll for that to be put into, that material to be put into Greek. Now, somewhere along the way, it seems, someone was impressed by the teachings of the Lord in the story of the Lord, if you understand what I mean. In other words, Jesus started out in his career as a great miracle worker. He went from synagogue to synagogue, village to village. People gathered around him. He healed. He cast out demons. He did many other things. Then he began to gather around him a coterie, a group of people he could call talmidim in Hebrew, or disciples. These people in those days did this kind of thing with other rabbis. They went from place to place in an itinerant fashion, and then he began to teach these disciples. Now, the interesting thing is that we have many illustrations in our Gospels of incidents or little things that happened on the road as he and his disciples went from place to place. So that the story told by the original writer in this text we call Matthew, the early one, writer Matthew, what he did was tell the incident, then Jesus would turn and teach in regard, because of this incident that had happened, something that came up, some kind of lesson he had to teach, and then he would end that with two parables. In an earlier time, we have called this, in an earlier one of these sessions, we called this the punchlines. This with a proof line. We know that in the Old Testament, for example, Gideon tested his divine instructions by having the fleece one day one thing and the fleece the next day of the dew on a different side, and so on. Two different proofs. And in the Old Testament, the basic idea of proof is that if you have two or more witnesses, and that's where you establish everything.
Out of the mouth of two witnesses.
Out of the mouth of two or more witnesses, right, everything shall be established. Then you have the story, for example, of Joseph, who always has, or nearly always has, two dreams. And he says when he gets the dreams of Pharaoh, for example, to explain them, this is double, that is, there are two dreams, because it is certain to happen and soon. And so the idea of proof of two makes sense when we come to these two double parables, which we have in our Gospels. Now, the interesting thing is that we some years ago discovered that these parables that were double are saying the same thing are scattered in our Gospels. And so in trying to understand this, we began some years ago to try to see if there were themes that if you took one unit of material and you put it with another, you might recover something of the original chronology of some of the stories. And we now have about 15 or 16 what I would call recovered stories. They're all there in the Gospels. The Gospels have beautifully retained them, especially Matthew and Luke. The wording is in Greek so good that we can translate back to Hebrew and get good Hebrew texts. And the beautiful thing about it all is that somehow I would say God has preserved for us these particular the text, so that now we're able to rearrange them slightly and come up with a recovered story very often.